Before Hollywood invented cowboys with white hats and silver bullets, there was a real man who stood for justice in a land ruled by chaos. His name was Bass Reeves, a man born into slavery, who rose to become one of the greatest lawmen the Wild West had ever known. This is not a story of fantasy. It's not a tale made of legend or myth. It's the true story of a man who chased 3,000 criminals and never lost a fight, not even to fate itself. In the summer of 1838, deep in Crawford County, Arkansas, a child was born. He came into this world with nothing, no name, no freedom, no future of his own. That child was Bass Reeves, born into the chains of slavery. His master, William Steele Reeves, was a farmer, politician, and man of wealth. To him, Bass was not a boy, just property, a worker in the fields. But inside that young boy's heart burned something different. Something his master could never own, a fierce, quiet spirit. Every morning before sunrise, Bass woke to the sound of the overseer's whip cracking through the air. He worked under the burning sun, his hands blistered, his back aching. And yet even then, he watched the world closely. He studied people, how they moved, how they spoke, how they lied. He remembered everything. He was tall for his age, strong and quick. But his greatest weapon wasn't his strength. It was his mind. He learned early that silence could protect him, that patience could keep him alive. Then came the Civil War. The country was tearing itself apart, North against South, slave against master. When war reached Texas, William Reeves joined the Confederate Army, and Bass, still enslaved, was forced to go with him as a body servant. He cooked, he cleaned, he cared for horses. But the battlefield showed him something new, a world beyond the fences of the plantation. He saw men fighting not for money but for freedom. He heard the whispers that the Union Army was freeing the enslaved. Hope began to take root inside him, dangerous hope. One night, legend says, fate made its move. Bass and his master were playing cards by firelight. The air was tense. A word was said, too sharp, an insult, too deep. Then suddenly, a fight broke out. The details differ in every telling. Some say Bass struck his master and fled. Others say he escaped under gunfire during battle. But one truth remains the same. Bass Reeves ran. He rode into the darkness and never looked back. Behind him were slave catchers and soldiers. Ahead of him was the unknown, wild land, open skies, and danger at every turn. He was hunted, cornered, desperate. But he kept riding, guided by something stronger than fear. He was riding toward freedom. For days he traveled through the wilderness, surviving on what little food he could find. At last, he crossed into Indian Territory, a vast region that belonged to native nations. The Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole. There, among people who had also known pain and injustice, Bass found shelter. He lived with the tribes for years. They taught him to ride better, to shoot straighter, and to move through forests without a sound. He learned to speak their languages, Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole. He learned respect, he learned discipline, and he learned what true freedom felt like. In those years, Bass Reeves was reborn, no longer a runaway, no longer a servant, but a man learning to master his destiny. When the war finally ended in 1865, slavery was abolished. The world Bass left behind no longer existed. But freedom came with no roadmap, no guide for how to live, no promise of safety. Many freed people wandered, lost and uncertain, but not Bass. He returned to Arkansas, determined to build a life of his own. He became a farmer and rancher near Van Buren. He worked hard, saved money, and soon married a woman named Jenny Reeves. Together they built a home and raised children, living proof that even a man born in chains could create his own future. For a time, peace followed him. But the West was changing. The land beyond Arkansas, Indian Territory, had become lawless. Outlaws and bandits ruled, murdering settlers, stealing horses, and vanishing into the plains. It was a place where lawmen rarely survived. But Bass Reeves wasn't afraid of the wilderness. He knew it better than any white man. He had lived there. He spoke the languages. He could track a man for days without leaving a trace. And soon, destiny came knocking again. In 1875, a new federal judge arrived in Fort Smith, Arkansas. His name was Isaac C. Parker, later known as the Hanging Judge. Parker was determined to bring justice to Indian Territory. But to do that, he needed deputies who could go where others wouldn't dare. One of those deputies James F. Fagan had heard stories of a tall black man who could shoot the eye out of a crow at 100 yards. A man who knew the land like the back of his hand. A man named Bass Reeves. Fagan offered Reeves a badge, the silver star of a Deputy U.S. Marshal. For the first time in his life, Bass Reeves held real power, not power over others, but power to protect, to serve, to uphold justice. The boy born a slave was now sworn to enforce the law of the United States. He would ride into outlaw country alone, armed only with his pistols, his faith, and his iron will. He had escaped chains once. Now he would use that same fire to break the chains of lawlessness across the frontier. And so began the legend of Bass Reeves, the real Lone Ranger. Bass Reeves stood tall outside the federal courthouse in Fort Smith, Arkansas. The building was crowded with outlaws, deputies, and nervous townsfolk. It smelled of gun oil, sweat, and tobacco. Inside waited Judge Isaac C. Parker, the man known across the frontier as the hanging judge. For Bass, this was a new beginning. He had lived as a slave, a runaway, and a farmer. Now he was being asked to wear a badge, a silver star that would turn him into a man of the law. The deputy who brought him there, James F. Fagan, studied Bass closely. He had heard stories about this man, how he spoke Cherokee and Creek, how he could shoot with both hands, how he never lost his cool under pressure. Fagan knew the Indian Territory better than most, and he knew it was full of killers, thieves, and desperate men hiding from justice. He also knew Bass Reeves was the kind of man who could face them without fear. When Bass accepted the badge, he did it quietly. He did not make a speech. He simply nodded and placed the star on his vest. It was the same vest he had worn while farming his small plot of land, now transformed into the uniform of a U.S. Marshal. The work began immediately. The Indian Territory stretched over 75,000 square miles. Vast plains, rocky hills, deep forests, and no real towns. There were few roads and even fewer laws. It was a land of fugitives, horse thieves, murderers, men who believed they could vanish forever. Most lawmen refused to go there. Those who did often never returned. But Bass Reeves knew that land. He had once hidden there as a runaway. He knew every creek, every narrow path, every shadow that could hide a man. Armed with 2 Colt revolvers and a repeating rifle, Bass set out on his first mission. He rode a strong gray horse and carried the wanted papers tucked in his saddlebag. Each name on that list was a man who thought the law could never touch him. Bass was determined to prove them wrong. On his first trip, he rode for days without seeing another soul. The wind was dry, the sun burned his neck, and coyotes cried through the night. But he stayed alert, sleeping lightly, his revolvers always within reach. When he finally reached a small camp deep in the woods, he spotted 3 men sitting by the fire. They were eating beans from a tin and laughing loud, never guessing a deputy was watching from the dark. Bass waited. He studied them, their movements, their weapons, their confidence. Then he rode straight into camp, calm as a preacher on Sunday. The outlaws froze. Bass greeted them politely and asked for a place to rest his horse. He spoke with an easy tone, pretending to be just another traveler. The men relaxed. They offered him food and talked about the crimes they had committed, proud of what they had done. That night, while they slept, Bass quietly tied their horses together and hid their guns. At dawn he woke them with his rifle aimed steady. "You're under arrest," he said simply. When they laughed, he fired 1 warning shot. That was enough. They followed him back to Fort Smith without another word. Judge Parker was impressed. Few deputies ever brought in their first outlaws alive. Bass had brought 3. Word spread quickly. A black lawman who rode alone into outlaw country and came back with his prisoners every time. To some it sounded impossible. To others, it was terrifying. But to Bass, it was only duty. He learned that being a marshal was not about gunfights or glory. It was about patience, courage, and respect for the badge. He treated every prisoner fairly. He never shot unless there was no other way. Sometimes he would ride hundreds of miles to serve 1 warrant. He used clever disguises, farmer, preacher, ranch hand, to get close to his targets. He could change his voice, his walk, even his smile. When the outlaw finally realized who he was, it was already too late. One story told in Fort Smith spoke of the time Bass dressed as a beggar. He wore ragged clothes and carried a broken hat. He told a farmer he was looking for work, and the farmer took him in. That same farmer was the very man Bass had come to arrest. After breakfast the next morning, Bass asked politely, "Do you know a man named Reeves? They say he's catching all the outlaws around here." The farmer laughed. "If that fool ever comes this way, I'll kill him myself." Bass nodded, smiled, and said, "Well, sir, you just met him." Before the man could move, Bass had his gun drawn. The arrest was quick and clean. Another fugitive off the list. Over time, the people of Indian Territory began to recognize him, the tall black man with the calm eyes and silver badge. Children watched him ride past in silence, their parents whispering stories about his bravery. Even the worst criminals started to fear his name. They called him the Devil's Deputy, but Bass never let fear or pride guide him. He worked the same way he always had, quiet, careful, focused. He trusted in skill, not luck, and though danger followed him everywhere, he stayed calm, even under fire. Once, while escorting a prisoner, an ambush broke out. Bullets whistled through the air, striking the trees beside him. Bass dismounted, took cover, and returned fire with precision. When the smoke cleared, 2 attackers lay dead, and the prisoner sat shaking on the ground. Bass simply reloaded and kept moving. To him, it was another day's work. By the end of his first year, Bass Reeves had captured more fugitives than most deputies managed in a lifetime. He became a legend not just for his skill, but for his honor. He never took a bribe. He never abused his power. And he always kept his word. He was living proof that a man's color didn't define his courage. His character did. Yet even as his reputation grew, so did the danger. The more outlaws he caught, the more enemies he made. There were bounties placed on his head and traps set along his path. But Bass Reeves rode on, fearless and steady, his faith stronger than any threat. The boy born a slave had become the most respected lawman in the West. And this was only the beginning of his legend. Bass Reeves had been a Deputy U.S. Marshal for only a few years. But already his name traveled faster than a bullet. From the muddy streets of Fort Smith to the wild plains of Indian Territory, people whispered stories about him. Stories of bravery, cunning, and impossible arrests. Some said he could hit a target dead center while galloping full speed. Others swore he could track a man through rain and darkness for days without rest. Most of what they said was true. But Bass Reeves didn't care for stories. He cared about duty. And duty for him meant riding out alone, day after day, into a land filled with men who would rather shoot than surrender. The Indian Territory in the 1870s was a dangerous place. It wasn't just a hiding ground for criminals. It was their kingdom. There were no police, no towns with jails, and no courts nearby. Only open land, scattered cabins, and lawlessness. When Bass Reeves rode through, outlaws often laughed. To them, the idea of a black lawman enforcing white man's justice seemed like a joke. But when they saw his calm face and the way his hands hovered near his revolvers, that laughter always died quickly. Reeves didn't have to shout or threaten. He spoke softly, and somehow that quiet voice carried more power than a dozen guns. One summer morning, Bass received a warrant for 2 brothers wanted for murder and robbery near the Canadian River. They were known for their cruelty and for never taking prisoners. Most deputies refused to go after them. Bass saddled his horse, loaded his rifle, and left before sunrise. For 3 days he followed faint trails through the brush. He found footprints near a stream, ashes from a dying fire, and a set of horseshoes with 1 nail missing. That was enough for him to know he was close. At dusk on the 4th day he saw smoke in the distance. He dismounted, tied his horse, and crept through the grass until he saw their camp. The 2 brothers were laughing, their guns resting nearby, a pot of beans boiling over the fire. Bass didn't rush in. He waited. He watched every movement, every small detail. When they finally laid down to sleep, he moved silently, cutting off their escape. Before dawn, his voice broke the silence. "Gentlemen," he said calmly, "you're under arrest." They reached for their guns, but Bass was faster. He didn't fire. He simply stared at them, his rifle steady, his eyes unblinking. Something in that look told them the fight was over before it began. He brought both men back alive. 4 days' ride, no help, no backup. When he arrived at Fort Smith, the crowd outside the courthouse cheered. Even the other deputies shook their heads in disbelief. Judge Parker smiled and said, "Mr. Reeves, it seems no man escapes your hand." Bass only replied, "Just doing my duty, sir." His reputation grew with every case. Soon, fugitives began surrendering when they heard he was after them. They knew that running was useless. Bass would find them, no matter how far they fled. But with fame came danger. There were ambushes waiting on lonely trails. There were bounty hunters paid to kill him. There were nights when bullets tore through his coat, missing his body by inches. Still, Bass never turned back. He believed that fear was a luxury no marshal could afford. He rode by faith and skill alone. One story tells of a gunfight near the Red River. Bass had been tracking a wanted man who had murdered a storekeeper and fled south. When Reeves finally caught up, the outlaw stood outside his cabin, rifle ready. "I've heard about you," the man shouted. "You ain't taking me alive." Bass sat straight in his saddle, his revolver still in its holster. "Then you best not miss," he said. The outlaw fired first. The bullet tore through Bass's hat, grazing his scalp. Before the smoke cleared, Bass drew his pistol and fired once. The outlaw fell, his gun still in his hand. When Bass dismounted, he picked up the man's rifle and examined it. He whispered a small prayer before covering the body. He never celebrated a killing. To him, taking a life, even in self-defense, was the worst part of the job. There were times when Reeves faced more than bullets. He faced prejudice, hatred, and disbelief. Some white settlers refused to believe a black man could be a true U.S. Marshal. They questioned his authority, his intelligence, his right to wear the badge. But every successful arrest silenced them a little more. Bass didn't argue with words. He answered with results. He earned respect the hard way, through courage and consistency. Judge Parker himself once said that Bass Reeves was one of the best marshals to ever serve his court. High praise in a time when equality was still a dream. Despite his growing fame, Bass lived a simple life. He didn't drink or gamble. He prayed before every mission and carried his Bible in his saddlebag. When other men bragged about their kills, he stayed quiet. He never wanted to be seen as a hero. He saw himself as a servant, to justice and to God. Yet, even legends have families waiting at home. His wife Jenny worried every time he rode out. His children watched him polish his guns in silence, too young to understand why their father risked his life for strangers. Sometimes weeks would pass before they heard from him. Then one evening he'd ride back, dusty and tired, but alive. He'd hug his children, eat a quiet meal, and by morning, he'd be gone again. That was the life of a lawman. That was the price of duty. By the mid-1880s, Bass Reeves had become a living legend. He was respected by the U.S. Marshals, feared by outlaws, and admired by anyone who believed in justice. But fame didn't soften him. If anything, it made him more careful. He knew that with every arrest came new enemies, men who wanted revenge. But Bass didn't chase glory. He chased peace, peace for a land that had forgotten what law meant. He once said to a fellow deputy, "A man must do right, even when it costs him." And those words would guide him through the hardest years yet to come. Because soon, Bass Reeves would face challenges that would test not just his skill, but his soul. Bass Reeves had now spent years wearing the silver badge. The Indian Territory feared him, respected him, and whispered his name like a warning in the wind. Every outlaw knew one truth. If Bass Reeves was on your trail, your days as a free man were numbered. But being a lawman in those wild lands was not glory. It was dust, danger, and death waiting around every canyon. For every victory there was a scar, and for every arrest there was another man willing to take revenge. Still, Bass rode on. He rode because justice to him was not an idea. It was a duty. One cold morning in the late 1870s, Bass received new warrants from Judge Parker's court. Among them was a name that made even the bravest deputies hesitate. Jim Webb, a murderer who had escaped from custody and killed 2 men during his flight. Most officers refused to go after him. Webb was a crack shot and had a small gang loyal to him, but Bass didn't flinch. He studied the warrant, packed his gear, and said quietly, "I'll bring him in." He rode west for days, crossing creeks swollen from spring rains. He asked questions in trading posts and farms, learning that Webb's gang had been seen near the Deep Fork River. The locals warned him to stay away. Bass only nodded and kept riding. When he finally found the outlaw camp, Dusk was falling. The smell of smoke and roasting meat drifted through the air. Bass stopped on a ridge and looked down. There were 4 men around the fire, rifles leaning against a log. He watched them, memorizing every detail, where their guns were, how they moved, which one kept looking over his shoulder. He waited until the fire burned low. Then he crept closer, silent as the night. When he was only a few yards away, one of the men looked up, startled. Before the outlaw could shout, Bass stepped into the light, revolvers drawn. "Jim Webb," he said calmly, "you're under arrest." The camp erupted. 2 men reached for their guns. Bass fired twice. Both fell before they could pull the trigger. Webb turned and ran toward his horse, firing over his shoulder. A bullet grazed Bass's coat, tearing through the sleeve. Bass knelt, aimed, and fired once. The shot struck Webb's revolver, knocking it from his hand. "Don't make me shoot again," Bass warned. The outlaw froze. Moments later, he was in irons. Bass rode back to Fort Smith with Webb tied to his saddle. Judge Parker looked at the bruised prisoner and simply said, "You did it again, Reeves." Bass only replied, "Yes, sir. He's alive. The court can do the rest." Such victories made his legend grow, but each ride left him more aware of the danger. Ambushes became common. Once, a gang waited for him in a narrow canyon. They fired the moment he appeared, bullets cutting through the air like bees. Bass dropped from his horse and crawled behind a fallen tree. He reloaded calmly, firing 1 shot at a time. When the smoke cleared, 2 men were dead and the rest had fled. Bass's horse lay wounded, but the Marshal survived with only a torn hat and a scratched arm. He walked 15 miles to the nearest settlement and borrowed another horse. By sundown, he was back on the trail. To him, quitting was never an option. Not all his missions ended in gunfire. Sometimes justice came quietly through patience and cunning. Bass became known for his disguises, his secret weapon against prideful criminals. In one famous case, he dressed as a ragged farmer, driving an old wagon pulled by mules. He covered his badge with dirt and wore a torn hat. He approached the home of 2 wanted men who lived near the Canadian River. When they saw him, they laughed. "Old man, you look like you've been dragged through hell," one of them joked. Bass smiled and asked for a drink of water. They invited him in, bragging about the money they'd stolen. Bass listened politely, waiting for the right moment. When one of the men bent to pick up a fallen cup, Bass pulled his revolver. "Boys," he said in a steady voice, "you're both under arrest." The outlaws froze. By the time they realized who he was, their hands were already bound. Stories like this spread everywhere. People began to say Bass Reeves could walk into the devil's camp and come back leading him in chains. Parents told their children to behave, or Bass Reeves would come for them. His very name became a warning, and a symbol of order in a lawless world. But for all the fame, Bass stayed humble. He slept on the ground beside his horse, cooked his own food, and shared what little he had with other deputies. He never asked for special treatment. He believed that justice was sacred work and that the badge was heavier than it looked. In 1882, tragedy struck close to home. During one pursuit, Bass's companion, a young posseman, was shot and killed beside him. Bass carried the boy's body back to town himself. He didn't speak for days after the funeral. When someone asked how he could keep doing such dangerous work, he answered softly, "If we stop chasing evil, evil wins." That simple sentence became the heart of who he was. By the end of that decade, Bass Reeves had captured hundreds more outlaws. Some were thieves, some were killers. A few were men he had once known as friends. But the law, to Bass, had no favorites. He arrested the rich and the poor alike. He never took a bribe, never looked the other way. His word was trusted in every courtroom. Even criminals admitted he was fair. He treated prisoners with respect, fed them, and protected them from angry mobs. When they asked why, he said, "The badge stands for justice, not hate." By now, even the toughest gangs planned their crimes around one question: is Reeves anywhere nearby? If the answer was yes, they moved on. No one wanted to face the tall Marshal with calm eyes and perfect aim. Yet Bass knew that his mission was far from over. The frontier was still wild. Every arrest made space for another outlaw to rise. But he rode anyway, because that was what he was born to do. The boy who had once run from his master now made murderers run from him. The man who had once been hunted now hunted evil itself. Bass Reeves, the slave who became the law, was no longer just a name whispered in fear. He was a symbol of justice, courage, and relentless will. And the next chapter of his life would test that will more than ever before. By the mid-1880s, Bass Reeves was more than a lawman. He was a living legend. Everywhere he went, people spoke his name in awe. To the innocent, he was a guardian. To the guilty, he was a shadow that never missed its mark. For nearly 10 years, Bass had ridden the wild lands of Indian Territory, arresting murderers, horse thieves, and desperados. He had faced ambushes, storms, and sleepless nights under a blanket of stars. And still, he never broke his promise to the badge. But justice for Bass Reeves was not just about catching criminals. It was about doing what was right, even when it tore his soul apart. One morning, while sitting in his small office in Fort Smith, Bass received a sealed envelope. The clerk handed it to him quietly. When Bass opened it, he froze. Inside was a warrant. The name written on it struck like a hammer to his heart. Benny Reeves, his own son. The boy he had raised with love and pride was wanted for murder. The report said Benny had killed his wife during an argument and fled into the territory. Bass read the words again and again, hoping they would change. They did not. For the first time in his life, the badge on his chest felt heavier than iron. Friends urged him to step aside, to let another deputy take the case. But Bass refused. He said quietly, "If I don't uphold the law, I have no right to wear this badge." So he saddled his horse and rode out, not as a father, but as a marshal. The road was long, and every step felt like a punishment. Memories filled his mind, teaching Benny to ride, to read, to pray before bed. Now that same boy was a fugitive, and justice demanded his capture. When Bass finally found him, Benny was hiding in the woods near Muskogee. The moment their eyes met, time seemed to stop. Benny dropped his head. "I knew you'd come," he whispered. Bass said nothing for a long while. Then he spoke softly. "Son, you know what I have to do." Benny nodded. "Yes, sir." Bass placed the cuffs on his son's wrists with trembling hands. They rode back in silence. When Judge Parker saw who the prisoner was, even he was moved. The case was handled with dignity. Benny was sentenced to prison, and Bass continued his work, heartbroken but unbroken. People across the territory spoke of that arrest for years. They said it proved what kind of man Bass Reeves truly was, a man who served the law above all else. After that, something changed in Bass. He grew quieter, more reflective. He still hunted criminals, but he began to think more deeply about mercy. He often spoke to his prisoners about redemption. He told them that a man's past didn't have to control his future. Many of those he captured later said Bass Reeves treated them with more respect than they deserved. One outlaw, years after his release, said, "That Marshal didn't hate me. He just wanted me to be better." That was the power of Bass Reeves. He could bring a man to justice and still see the human being beneath the crime. But even mercy couldn't keep him safe. There were always new threats. In 1889, Bass was falsely accused of murder himself. A man he had arrested months earlier had died in custody, and some claimed Reeves had shot him out of anger. Bass faced trial, standing before the same court where he had delivered hundreds of criminals. The courtroom was silent as the evidence was read. Bass sat calm, his face unreadable. He trusted the truth. Witnesses came forward, proving that the death had been accidental and that Bass had acted in self-defense. After days of tension, the jury declared him not guilty. When he walked out of that courtroom, he didn't smile. He simply said, "Even the law must prove itself." That trial only deepened his legend. It showed that not even false accusations could stain the name of Bass Reeves. The years rolled on, and so did his missions. He continued to ride through storms and deserts, catching outlaws who had escaped every other man. He once captured 20 prisoners in a single trip, marching them back to Fort Smith chained together behind his horse. When asked how he did it, Bass shrugged and said, "They got tired. I didn't." His calm confidence became famous. A newspaper once wrote, "Bass Reeves can ride through hell with a smile and come out with the devil in handcuffs." Even the toughest men learned to surrender peacefully when they saw him. He had a presence that felt larger than fear. But while his legend grew, the world around him began to change. The railroads came. Towns sprang up. Civilization slowly replaced wilderness. The West was growing smaller, and the frontier that had once defined Bass Reeves was fading away. Still, he carried on, riding from dawn till dark, enforcing laws in a world that was beginning to forget what the old ones had cost. At night, when he camped alone under the stars, he sometimes thought about the past, the whip, the chains, the long ride into freedom, and the promise he had made to himself, to be a man of honor no matter the price. He had kept that promise. By the late 1890s, Bass Reeves had served for more than 20 years. He was older now, his hair streaked with gray, but his aim was still steady and his mind still sharp. Younger deputies looked up to him as a mentor. He taught them how to track, how to stay calm in a fight, how to serve the badge with respect. When asked why he never retired, he said, "The law still needs riding." And so he kept riding, through wind, rain, and the endless call of justice. Bass Reeves had faced down hundreds of killers. He had fought for a country that once enslaved him. He had chosen honor over blood and mercy over hate. He was no longer just a lawman. He was a symbol, proof that integrity could rise from the harshest soil. And though his greatest battles were behind him, destiny still had one more test in store. Because the end of the frontier was coming, and with it, the final chapter of the legend of Bass Reeves. The year was 1900, and the frontier was changing. The endless plains that had once echoed with gunfire and galloping horses were now dotted with telegraph poles and train tracks. Civilization was crawling westward, replacing campfires with streetlights and wagons with steam engines. But even as the Old West faded, one man remained the same, Deputy U.S. Marshal Bass Reeves. For more than 25 years, he had chased outlaws across Indian territory. He had brought murderers to justice, faced ambushes, storms, and betrayal. Now, with gray in his beard and wisdom in his eyes, Bass still rode with the same calm strength that had made him a legend. He was older, but his reputation had only grown stronger. When criminals heard his name, they still felt fear. They said, "If Reeves is coming, it's already too late." In those years, Bass worked mostly out of Muskogee, one of the fastest-growing towns in the territory. The streets bustled with new settlers, merchants, and lawmen. But outside the town's limits, the wild still lived. Desperate men who couldn't let go of the old ways. One such outlaw was Frank Buck, a ruthless horse thief who had escaped every marshal sent after him. He knew the land well, hiding in the forests near the Arkansas River. When the warrant for Buck reached the marshal's office, everyone expected Bass Reeves to take it, and he did. He saddled his horse, packed his rifle, and rode out at dawn. No fanfare, no backup, just duty. For 2 days, Bass followed faint tracks through the woods. He found boot prints, broken branches, and the ashes of a fire still warm. Buck was close. At sunset on the 3rd day, Bass saw smoke rising from a small cabin. He dismounted and approached quietly, his boots sinking into soft dirt. Through a crack in the wall, he saw the outlaw sitting at a table, cleaning his revolver. Bass waited. He knew patience was his best weapon. When the outlaw finally stepped outside, Reeves raised his rifle and called, "Frank Buck, you're under arrest." Buck spun around, gun in hand, shouting, "You'll have to kill me first." He fired, but his shot went wide. Bass returned fire, hitting the outlaw's shoulder. The man dropped his gun and fell to his knees. Reeves walked over slowly and said, "You're lucky today. The law wants you alive." He tied the man's hands and took him back to Muskogee. Even wounded, Buck couldn't believe he'd been caught. He told the guards later, "That old man moved faster than anyone I ever saw." Stories like that kept Reeves's legend alive. But Bass himself never spoke about fame. He rarely gave interviews or bragged about his captures. When reporters asked him how many men he had arrested, he would simply say, "I lost count." "The law keeps me busy," he still rode long distances alone, carrying his Bible, his badge, and his unbreakable calm. But deep down he knew his time was nearing its end. The world was changing faster than even he could ride. New laws were being written. The Indian Territory was about to become part of a brand new state, Oklahoma. In 1907, that change finally came. Oklahoma joined the Union, and the old federal court system that had governed Indian Territory was dissolved. With it, the job of U.S. Marshals like Bass Reeves was over. After 32 years of service, one of the longest records in U.S. history, Bass turned in his badge. He stood silently in the courthouse as a younger deputy shook his hand. The badge that had once felt like a dream now felt like a farewell. He walked outside, looked at the horizon, and said quietly, "The law don't need chasing men anymore. It has found its home." For the first time in decades, Bass Reeves was no longer a marshal. He was simply a man again, but retirement didn't sit easily with him. Within a few months, the Muskogee Police Department offered him a position as a city patrolman. Bass accepted. At nearly 70 years old, he returned to the streets, not on horseback this time, but on foot, keeping watch over a city that had grown from wilderness to civilization. Residents often stared when they saw him in uniform. Many could hardly believe that the quiet old officer walking the streets was the same man who had once captured the most dangerous outlaws in the West. But Bass didn't care for recognition. He still worked with the same discipline he always had. He never drew his gun in anger, never missed a day, and never lost his sense of duty. Younger officers admired him deeply. They said he walked like time itself, slow, steady, unstoppable. In those final years, Bass often sat on his porch at night, polishing his old pistols and watching the sunset. He didn't talk much about the past, but sometimes when asked, he would smile faintly and say, "The West was rough, but it made men honest." He thought about the people he had arrested, thousands of them. Some had died, some had changed their lives, and some still sent him letters thanking him for giving them a second chance. He also thought about his son, Benny. By then, Benny had served his time and returned home. Father and son were finally at peace, sharing quiet meals and long silences that needed no words. For Bass, that peace meant more than any medal. In 1909, illness began to weaken him. Doctors called it Bright's disease, a slow failure of the kidneys. Even as his body grew frail, his spirit stayed unshaken. He refused pity. He refused fear. He told a friend, "When my time comes, I'll go like I rode, straight ahead." On January 12, 1910, Bass Reeves took his final breath in his home in Muskogee. He was 71 years old, no grand funeral, no marching band, just quiet respect from those who knew his story. He was buried not as a former slave, not even as a famous marshal, but as a man who had lived with honor. In the years that followed, people would begin to understand the scale of what he had done. Over 3,000 arrests, only 14 killings, all in self-defense. Decades of service without a stain on his record. Many began to whisper that he might have inspired the legend of the Lone Ranger, the mysterious rider who fought for justice in the Old West. If that was true, then the story had come full circle, because the real hero behind the mask had been a black man named Bass Reeves. When Bass Reeves passed away in 1910, the world did not stop. There were no front-page headlines, no statues, no songs sung in his name. The nation he had protected for more than 30 years moved on without him. The Old West was disappearing. Trains now roared where horses once ran, and telephones replaced telegrams. New heroes filled the papers: soldiers, inventors, industrialists. The lawman who had once tamed the wild frontier faded quietly into history. His grave in Muskogee, Oklahoma, was marked by a simple stone. No mention of his service, no note of his greatness, just a name: Bass Reeves. For a time, it seemed that his story, one of the most extraordinary in American history, would be forgotten forever. But legends do not die easily. They rest, they wait, and sometimes they return when the world is finally ready to listen. In the years after his death, whispers of his name continued to pass through the frontier towns. Old deputies who had served with him told stories to their grandchildren. Outlaws who had once faced him passed down tales of his courage and fairness. To some, he was a myth, too perfect to be real. To others, he was proof that honor could live in the unlikeliest of places. One story that never faded was the belief that Bass Reeves inspired the creation of the Lone Ranger, the fictional masked hero of radio, film, and television. No one could prove it completely, but the similarities were too striking to ignore. Both rode white horses. Both had Native American companions. Both captured criminals alive whenever possible. And both fought for justice in a land that had lost its way. But unlike the masked cowboy of fiction, Bass Reeves had no disguise, no silver bullets, and no scriptwriter to protect him. He had only courage, skill, and faith, the real tools of a real hero. By the 1930s, the myth of the Wild West filled theaters and radio shows. White heroes dominated the stories. The idea of a black lawman seemed unthinkable to most audiences of that time. And so Bass Reeves remained in the shadows of history, a legend hidden by silence. It wasn't until decades later that historians began to uncover the truth. In the 1960s and 1970s, scholars searching through old records at the Fort Smith courthouse found dusty files filled with Reeves's arrest reports and testimonies. Each one told a story of courage and justice. Each one was signed with the same steady hand, Deputy U.S. Marshal Bass Reeves. Researchers couldn't believe what they were reading. A man born into slavery had gone on to serve as one of the most successful lawmen in American history, something few textbooks had ever mentioned. The discovery sparked new interest. Writers, filmmakers, and educators began to dig deeper, determined to bring his story to light. One historian wrote, "Bass Reeves stands as proof that character is stronger than circumstance." Another said, "If he had been white, every child in America would have grown up knowing his name." Slowly, the world began to remember. Books were written, documentaries produced, and schools added his name to their history lessons. The people of Oklahoma and Arkansas started honoring him with exhibits and plaques. Finally, the truth was being told, and the more people learned, the more they were inspired. In 1992, Bass Reeves was inducted into the Cowboy Hall of Fame in Oklahoma City. In 1997, he was added to the Texas Trail of Fame. A statue of him, tall, proud, and eternal, was later erected in Fort Smith, Arkansas, near the courthouse where he had once delivered hundreds of prisoners. Visitors today can stand before that statue and see the man as he was. A towering figure in a long coat, his badge gleaming in the sun, his horse waiting beside him. No mask, no myth, just truth. Even Hollywood began to take notice. Films, TV shows, and documentaries started featuring Bass Reeves's story. He appeared in books, comics, and even a few Western dramas. In recent years, he has been portrayed by major actors, each bringing his quiet strength and fearless resolve to life. The world that once ignored him was now fascinated by him. His story had finally come full circle. He was no longer just the forgotten Marshal of the frontier. He had become a symbol of perseverance, justice, and moral courage that transcended race and time. What makes Bass Reeves's legacy so powerful is not just what he did, but how he did it. He arrested over 3,000 criminals, yet never abused his power. He fought in countless gunfights, but killed only when there was no other choice. He carried the law into places where no other man dared to go, not for glory, but for duty. In a time of hatred and division, he rose above prejudice. He never let bitterness control him. He proved that strength and kindness could exist in the same man. His story challenges us to ask, what does it mean to be truly honorable? To stand for something bigger than ourselves? To believe in justice, even when the world does not believe in you? Bass Reeves answered those questions with his life. Today, more than a century after his death, his name is spoken with reverence. Schools are named after him. Law enforcement agencies study his tactics, and thousands of people, from students to historians, draw inspiration from his courage. He may have been forgotten for a time, but legends like Bass Reeves never stay buried. They rise again, carried by truth, by history, and by the power of example. Bass Reeves once said, "Maybe the law ain't perfect, but it's the best we got. And without it, we got nothing." Those words still echo across America's story, a reminder that real heroes don't wear masks or seek fame. They simply do what is right, no matter the cost. And that is why the world will always remember Bass Reeves, the real Lone Ranger. For nearly a century after his death, the name Bass Reeves drifted quietly through the winds of history. He was remembered in whispers, mentioned in fading newspapers, and recalled only by a few old-timers who had heard tales of the black lawman who never missed. But the truth about Bass Reeves was too powerful to stay buried. In time, it would rise again, brighter and stronger than ever before. By the early 21st century, America began to look back at its past with new eyes. Historians, filmmakers, and writers started asking the hard questions. Who had really shaped the West? Who had been left out of its stories? That search led them to the forgotten files of the U.S. Marshal's service, and the name Bass Reeves began to reappear. Inside dusty record boxes and yellowed court papers, historians found his reports, thousands of them, each written in steady handwriting, signed with pride. Every file told the same story: a man of principle, courage, and unwavering honor. The discovery shocked many. For years, school books had celebrated cowboys and sheriffs, men with white hats and pale faces, but almost none had mentioned a black marshal who had captured more criminals than anyone else of his time. The truth hit like a thunderclap. The real Lone Ranger might have been a black man. Soon the legend began to return. Documentaries, books, and television specials brought his story back into the public eye. One of the first major works, Black Gun, Silver Star by historian Art T. Burton, told the world who Bass Reeves really was. Readers were stunned. For many, it was the first time they had ever heard his name. The more people learned, the more inspired they became. Bass Reeves wasn't just a Western hero. He was a symbol of resilience, justice, and quiet strength. In a world still struggling with racism and division, his life carried a timeless message. Character is greater than color. Courage is not bound by birth. Across America, his image began to appear again. In 2012, a powerful bronze statue of Bass Reeves was unveiled in Fort Smith, Arkansas, the very place where his long career had begun. The statue stands over 20 feet tall. Reeves on horseback, his badge glinting in the sunlight, his gaze fixed on the horizon. It faces the old courthouse of Judge Isaac Parker, where Bass had once delivered hundreds of outlaws. For visitors, the statue feels almost alive, not just a tribute, but a presence. You can almost hear the echo of hoofbeats, the rustle of the badge, the calm voice saying, "You're under arrest." People from all over the world travel to see it. They stand in silence, humbled by the story of a man who rose from chains to become one of history's greatest lawmen. But the recognition didn't stop there. In classrooms across the United States, teachers began including Bass Reeves in history lessons about the Old West and African American heroes. Children listened in disbelief. A few even said, "Why didn't we learn about him before?" His story became a source of pride and empowerment. For black students especially, Bass Reeves represented something long overdue, proof that heroism and leadership had always existed in their history, even when it was ignored. In museums and libraries, exhibits were dedicated to him. Paintings and books portrayed him not as a side character, but as the main figure of justice in a forgotten chapter of America's story. Then came Hollywood. After decades of silence, filmmakers and actors began to bring Bass Reeves to life on screen. He appeared in documentaries and feature films, portrayed by talented actors who understood the weight of his legacy. One of the most celebrated portrayals came in the 2023 Paramount Plus series, Lawman, Bass Reeves. The show, produced by Taylor Sheridan and starring David Oyelowo, presented Bass's life with respect and power. It showed the world the man behind the legend, his strength, his humanity, and his pain. Audiences around the world watched in awe. For many, it was their first real introduction to the true story behind the myth. Suddenly, Bass Reeves wasn't just a name in old books. He was a living, breathing symbol of justice, reborn for a new generation. As the years passed, tributes to him grew. The U.S. Marshal's Museum honored him with a permanent exhibit, celebrating his service and courage. Cities named streets, schools, and even buildings after him. Law enforcement officers studied his record, admiring his restraint, intelligence, and fairness. He became more than a figure from the past. He became a model for the present. His story reminded officers, teachers, and everyday citizens that strength does not come from power, but from integrity. Today, more than 100 years after his death, Bass Reeves stands as one of America's truest heroes. Not because of his badge, or his gun, or his fame, but because of what he represented. He proved that even a man born in bondage could rise above hate and fear to become a beacon of justice. He taught that doing right often means standing alone, and that courage is not the absence of fear, but the will to act despite it. His story continues to echo across time, not as a tale of revenge or violence, but of moral clarity. He didn't fight to destroy the world around him. He fought to make it better. And now, as new generations learn his name, the legend lives again, stronger, truer, and more inspiring than ever. Bass Reeves is no longer a forgotten lawman. He is the face of what justice was meant to be, fair, fearless, and free of prejudice. He is the reminder that one person's integrity can outlive a century of silence. He is, and will always be, the real Lone Ranger. More than a century after his death, the name Bass Reeves still rides through the American story, a shadow of truth that never fades. He may be gone, but his spirit continues to guide every person who believes in courage, fairness, and the idea that no one is above the law. In the quiet halls of the U.S. Marshal's Museum in Fort Smith, Arkansas, a bronze badge glows softly under the lights. It bears one name, Bass Reeves. Visitors stop and stare, reading about the man who arrested over 3,000 outlaws and never once backed down from justice. Law enforcement officers, young and old, come from across the country to stand before that exhibit. Some bow their heads, some whisper, "He was one of us." They see in Bass Reeves the image of what every peace officer hopes to be: calm under fire, loyal to the law, and respectful to all people. In an age where the idea of justice is often questioned, Reeves's story shines as a reminder of what true law enforcement means. He never served for fame or fortune. He served because he believed that order mattered, that justice was the foundation of freedom. Across the nation, his story has become part of training programs and lectures for modern marshals and police officers. They study his tactics, his patience, and his self-control. They discuss how he managed to maintain peace in some of the most dangerous lands without losing his humanity. One instructor once said, "Bass Reeves is the perfect example of authority with honor." He carried power, but used it with compassion. That balance, of strength and restraint, is what made him timeless. But Bass Reeves's influence isn't limited to law enforcement. His spirit has crossed into classrooms, books, films, and art. Children now grow up learning his name, hearing the story of a man born into slavery who became a symbol of integrity. In schools across the United States, his story is used to teach more than history. It teaches values, the importance of doing right even when no one is watching. Teachers say that when students hear about Bass Reeves, they sit straighter. They ask questions. They want to know how one man could face so much hate and still choose justice. And that perhaps is his greatest victory, that his life still inspires people to be better. In popular culture, Reeves's legend has taken on new life. Filmmakers and writers continue to bring him to the screen, ensuring his story reaches millions. The 2023 television series Lawman Bass Reeves became a global success. Audiences across the world watched the incredible true story of a man who overcame slavery and fear to bring law to the frontier. Actor David Oyelowo, who portrayed Reeves, said in an interview, "This is not just a Western story. This is an American story, the story of courage in its purest form." That statement struck a chord. Because Bass Reeves's life was never just about gunfights or chases, it was about moral strength. It was about believing that no matter who you are or where you come from, you have the power to stand for what is right. Artists have painted him. Authors have written about him. Rappers and poets have invoked his name as a symbol of rising above oppression. In cities like Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Little Rock, Arkansas, murals now show his face beside other great American icons. For African Americans, Reeves represents more than just a hero. He represents recognition long denied. He stands for those whose stories were silenced, whose contributions were erased. Through him, a new generation finds pride in its history. In 2020, the Bass Reeves Legacy Initiative was founded to honor his memory and promote his story worldwide. The group works with schools, law agencies, and media producers to ensure that his life is never forgotten again. They organize events, lectures, and memorial rides, where modern marshals ride horses in his honor across the same plains he once patrolled. Each year, more people join, carrying banners that read, "Ride for Justice," "Ride for Bass Reeves," At these events, you can see children dressed in cowboy hats and badges, pretending to be Bass. They don't see a man of one color or race. They see a hero who stood for what's right. That is the mark of a true legend. Even outside of America, Reeves's name has traveled. Foreign historians write about him as one of the greatest lawmen in the world. His story appears in museums from London to Tokyo, where people marvel that such a man existed. Real, not mythical. In one museum label, his story ends with a simple line: he wore no mask. His courage was his disguise. That single sentence captures everything Bass Reeves stood for. He didn't need symbols or capes. He was proof that real heroes walk quietly, act justly, and never seek applause. Today, his story continues to inspire books, podcasts, and online documentaries watched by millions. Every few months, new audiences discover him, and the same question arises: how did we not know about him before? That question itself is part of his legacy. It forces people to look deeper into history and see beyond the myths. Because Bass Reeves's life shows that greatness is not given. It's earned through endurance, humility, and faith. In a world often obsessed with fame, Bass Reeves remains a rare figure, a man remembered not for wealth or power, but for honor. He stood against injustice in a time when everything around him said he couldn't. He proved that real strength is moral, not physical, and that's why, even now, his spirit lives on, in every badge pinned to a uniform, in every officer who serves with integrity, and in every person who believes that doing right is worth the cost. The boy born in chains became the law of the free. The man who was once hunted became the protector of all, and even in death, Bass Reeves rides on, forever a symbol of justice without fear. Time moves forward, but true legends never fade. More than 100 years after Bass Reeves took his last breath, his story continues to echo through history. A voice that reminds us what courage, justice, and humanity really mean. He began life in chains. He ended life in honor, and everything in between became a bridge between the world of oppression and the dream of freedom. Bass Reeves was not born into power. He did not have privilege, wealth, or education. He started with nothing, no rights, no choices, no hope beyond survival. But what he did have was will. The unbreakable will to be free, and once free, to live by principle. That will made him a giant, not just of the Old West, but of the human spirit. He faced the same fear every man feels, but he never let it rule him. He faced hatred and prejudice, but he refused to answer with bitterness. He carried a badge in one hand and a Bible in the other, believing that justice and faith could walk side by side. When people today read about Bass Reeves, they often wonder how he did it, how one man could stay so strong for so long. The truth is simple. He believed that the law was not a weapon. It was a promise. A promise that right would triumph no matter how long it took. He once said, "A man must know right from wrong, and once he knows, he must never turn away." Those words guided him through deserts, gunfights, and loneliness. They guided him through the pain of arresting his own son. They guided him through years of danger that would have broken most men. Bass Reeves never turned away. Today, his story stands as a mirror for America, reflecting both its pain and its progress. He lived in a time when the color of a man's skin could decide his fate, yet he became one of the most respected lawmen in history. He showed the world that integrity has no color, and that bravery is not born from hate but from purpose. He walked through the fires of history and came out clean. He did not fight to be remembered, but he is remembered because he fought for what was right. In the towns he once rode through, Fort Smith, Muskogee, and beyond, his name is now spoken with pride. Children learn about him not as a side note in someone else's story, but as the main character in his own. They learn that the first black U.S. Marshal west of the Mississippi was not a myth, but a man, real, flawed, and extraordinary. His name now graces schools, buildings, and memorials. His bronze statue in Fort Smith watches over the city he once protected. It stands not just as a tribute, but as a lesson carved in metal. That honor is stronger than history's silence. Filmmakers, authors, and artists continue to breathe life into his legend. Every time his story is told, it reaches someone new, a young dreamer, a police officer, a teacher, a student. Each one walks away with the same feeling. If Bass Reeves could stand for what's right, so can I. That's what makes a legend eternal. It's not about fame or statues. It's about the fire left behind, a light for others to follow. In today's world, where justice is often debated and truth feels blurred, Bass Reeves' story reminds us of something simple but powerful. Doing what's right doesn't depend on applause. It depends on conscience. He proved that one person's courage can shape generations. He showed that humility can walk hand in hand with power. He lived a life that was quiet in fame but thunderous in meaning, and because of that, he belongs not just to history, but to everyone who believes in decency, fairness, and courage. When the wind sweeps across the plains of Oklahoma, you can almost imagine him still there, the tall rider on a gray horse watching the horizon with calm eyes. No mask, no silver bullets, just faith, skill, and a badge that once gleamed under the same sun. Maybe the horses are gone now. Maybe the frontier has changed. But the spirit of Bass Reeves, the real Lone Ranger, still rides. He rides in the hearts of those who stand up for what's right. He rides in the actions of every person who chooses justice over comfort, truth over lies, duty over fear. He rides in every lawman who remembers that power means nothing without honor, and he rides in every dreamer who believes that where you start in life doesn't decide where you end up. Bass Reeves once lived in a world that doubted him. Now that same world honors him. He is no longer the forgotten hero of the Wild West. He is its truest one. He proved that greatness is not born from privilege, but from perseverance. He showed that justice is not a color or a class, it's a calling. And through his life, he gave the world one unshakable truth. You can rise from the lowest place and stand among the greatest if you never lose sight of what's right. More than a legend, more than a lawman, Bass Reeves became a symbol of what it means to live with honor when the world gives you every reason not to. And though his horse no longer rides, though his badge no longer shines, his story will never end. Because men like Bass Reeves don't just live in books. They live in every act of courage, every moment of truth, every hand that reaches for justice. The man who once rode through the wild frontier now rides forever through time, unmasked, unbroken, and unforgettable.